Bill Gates once made a video game, and I don't just mean he executively produced it or anything. I mean he actually designed and programmed it, though not by himself. He did it alongside Neil Konzen, an early Microsoft employee. This game is one of the most creative games ever made, simply known as Donkey.Base. Donkey.Base was a game included with early versions of the IBM PC-DOS operating system that came with the original IBM PC. IBM had contracted Microsoft to develop the operating system, and this game was meant as a showcase for what BASIC and the original IBM PC could do. Very impressive. At this point, you have seen literally everything the game has to offer. You drive a car and switch lanes to avoid donkeys. If you avoid enough donkeys, it's a point for you. But if you get hit by a donkey, it's a point for the donkey. Absolutely incredible. Yeah, this game isn't interesting for anything other than the fact that it exists, and I had to let the world know. I first found out about this game because as a kid, I was obsessed with stuff like Microsoft Paint and Windows games like Solitaire. Anybody remember Purple Place? And with that obsession came an obsession with Windows' history. And I found a website called PCJ's Machines that emulates a bunch of early computer stuff that was linked in the Wikipedia article for Windows 1.0. It was through browsing this website that I found out about Donkey.Base and eventually its history. It's honestly not a very engaging game, Pong is more engaging, but its mere existence and the fact that it was handmade by Bill Gates is hilarious. Really, what I want you to take out of this is to check out PCJ's Machines if you're at all interested in early computer history like this. It's really neat. I'll link to it in the description. Pepsiman has gained quite the cult following in recent years, originally starting off as Pepsi's Japanese mascot, before getting a game for the original PlayStation that has become quite the cult classic. However, while Pepsiman is well known, literally no one talks about Coca-Cola's Japanese mascot who also got a video game. Koki. Koki supposedly starred in a series of Japanese commercials, but no matter how hard I look, I can't find a single one. Probably because of the lack of keywords if they have been uploaded online. And yes, for those people in the comments, I searched in Japanese. So these commercials might be lost media right now. Now, this wasn't Coke's first video game. That would be Pepsi Invaders for the Atari 2600, a hack of that system's Space Invaders port commissioned by Coke and developed by Atari, where you shoot down the letters that form the word Pepsi and their logo to show the world that Coke is the best. Yeah. This game's actually somehow more well known than the one I'm about to cover. Anyways, Sega published a game based on the Koki character called Sasou Shonen Eiyuden Coca-Cola Kid in 1994 for the Game Gear of all platforms. And it was developed by Aspect, most known for developing some of the 8-bit Sonic games. I've always been fascinated by these games' developments because not much is known about them or why they existed, though it's not too hard to formulate a theory about the latter. Aspect itself was a contract developer founded by ex-Conoco employees, and they went bankrupt in 2018. By the way, while we're on the subject of 8-bit Sonic games, did you know the Sonic Drift games were developed by Arc System Works? Who would have thought the Sonic Drift team would have become one of the most dominant fighting game devs? Anyways, Coca-Cola Kid actually feels a lot like Aspect Sonic games, but it's really refreshing for how different it is from Sonic, with its anime art style and modern realistic cityscapes. Oh, yeah. It actually kind of is a Sonic clone though, with its own distinct mechanics, actually sharing code with Sonic and Tails, which is actually much less prevalent of a genre than you would think. Probably because a lot of these games, including this one sadly, fundamentally misunderstand what made those games work. And that's that fast-paced platforming only works when the character is able to consistently defend itself, and that the game should still be fun when taken slowly with engaging, approachable level design. Stuff that a lot of people, even those very educated in game design and super attentive, somehow do not notice or understand. Like, everyone complains about how these games are nothing but trial and error, but that's not true at all. People complain about how you get hit all the time in these games, but they're not auto-scrollers. They don't force you to go fast. It's like the only game series where people's perception of them is made worse by a perception created by something outside of the game itself. They're not speed-based platformers. They're platformers that can be played at any pace and still be fun. They just encourage you to get better so you can speedrun them. They're not the overly alternative gimmick games everyone thinks they are. Until they were, but I'm not getting into that. But Coca-Cola Kid isn't too bad in spite of suffering from the usual oversights that plague these games. For one, Koki doesn't get hit from touching enemies, just attacks, but he still doesn't have any form of persistent defense. Also, I can't rag them on the level design being mostly unengaging, thus making it kind of tedious to approach at a slow pace, as the same problem kinda plagues the 8-bit Sonic games thanks to the limitations of the hardware not allowing for the same kinds of level design complexity as the 16-bit games. It really is just an alright game, which follows Koki as he tries to rescue his teacher who has been kidnapped by a gang leader. What does this have to do with Coke? Well, there's Coke branding everywhere in this game. Really, that's it. You just go level to level in a very fast-paced platformer and nothing really wacky happens. Until you get to the end of the game, which is pretty infamous, but I'm not spoiling it here. You'll just have to see for yourself. It's alright. I really just wanted to showcase it because if you love the 8-bit Sonic games, you might like this one. And I felt more people should know that Coke had their own equivalent to Pepsiman. Also, I forgot to mention it came bundled with a snazzy red Game Gear. From one Sega game to another, we have Pepsiman Pingo, released exclusively for the Mega Drive in Japan. Before we get into the game, you notice anything off about the box art? No? Well, I'll tell you at the end of this segment. Watch time, baby. Anyways, the original Pingo was a 1982 arcade game distributed by Sega and developed by Copeland, a company that would later become known as Bon Presto. Oh. Also, Arc System Works developed the Game Gear version, which was a launch title for the system in Japan. You know, I find it weird that Sega reused one of their old arcade characters, Flicky, for Sonic the Hedgehog, but would create a new Penguin character instead of doing something similar by using Pingo. Anyways, what's really interesting about this game is that 2 years after Pingo would release, Capcom would release the game Pirate Ship Higemaru, which plays very similarly to it, and they would reiterate on these gameplay concepts in its sequels Makaijima and Goof Troop for the Super Nintendo. I'm not kidding. These games all take inspiration from Pingo's gameplay, which involves the player pushing blocks to eliminate every enemy on screen. Now, there are tons of block pushing games and arcade elimination games, but there aren't many games that combine the two like this. Basically, think Bomberman but with block pushing instead of bombs. Except Pingo came out even before the MSX version of Bomberman. Pepsiman Pingo, released in 1995, is the only real sequel to Pingo, and was Sega's last first-party release for the Mega Drive in Japan, though it technically shares that title with Surgical Strike, which released the same day if you count add-ons. Yeah, they didn't get either of the Vectorman games or Sonic 3D for the Mega Drive in Japan. 1995 was a weird time for the Mega Drive in Japan. since the Saturn had just launched late the previous year and had become far more successful over there. So Sega's last-ditch effort to boost the system's popularity in Japan was to release a flood of titles that had seen success in the West to see if they would get the same love in Japan, with some of these games even using European Mega Drive logos on the box art. But Sega also just straight up sabotaged the release of some of these Western games in Japan. And I recommend watching Slope's Game Room's video about the Japanese release of the Ooze if you want to hear about that. While the previous year saw the biggest flurry of third-party support the system had ever seen, and Sega had made a push for more RPGs to be released on the system with their Mega Roleplay Project initiative to boost the system's popularity in Japan, which worked a little bit, it was clearly on its way out. If you want to hear more about why the Mega Drive failed in Japan, I made a video on why that was. Yeah, I know I keep recommending other videos, but I don't like covering stuff that's already been covered and want to focus more on the stuff that hasn't been. So how was Sega's last hurrah to the console they had tried so hard for the past 7 years to make a success in their home country? Well, it actually wasn't developed by a Sega studio. It was done by Japan's System House, the same company behind the mysterious Tails Sky Patrol, and apparently an affiliate company of Chaos, aka infamous contract developer Micronix. Anyways, regardless, how is it? It's pretty good. I don't have much to say about it though. It's a real shame that it didn't release in the US because I think it would have done alright with how Sega was still pushing the Genesis, and a cute kid-friendly game like this is perfect for a system late in its life becoming a cheap alternative to the newer consoles or a hand-me-down. It also includes the original Pingo as well. It's fantastic. I really don't have a lot to say about it. It's really just what you'd expect from an expanded Pingo, and I think it's a weirdly overlooked game for what's such a significant release in the Mega Drive library. You should definitely play it if you like stuff like Bomberman. Really, I just want more people to play it, and I want this weird small genre to get more attention. Oh yeah, by the way, this is what I was talking about with the cover. Galaxian has a lot of weird sequels. And no, I'm not talking about the more popular Galaga, or even G+ Galaxian 3 or the crazy UGSF franchise that spawned from it. I'm talking about something else. But before I get into it, I just want to say I am the only person in this world who actually likes Galaxian. Yes, I'm really about to go to bat for Galaxian. Hear me out. Everyone else thinks that Galaga is just a better Galaxian, and I will agree it's the better game, but I see a lot of people who say that Galaga makes Galaxian outright irrelevant, and I can't disagree more. Regardless of opinion, the idea that Galaga is just a better Galaxian is just straight up untrue. It's not an improvement sequel, it's a sequel with added gimmicks, and it doesn't truly make Galaxian irrelevant. Its changes, like how enemies fly in and the captured ship dual fighter mechanic, stray quite a far bit away from Galaxian, and aren't really improvements upon its gameplay, but more so just additions to it. Galaxian's more straightforward enemy formations make it stand apart, and its limited shots make it a more strategic experience. Yet it's still more fast-paced and different from Space Invaders. It can never truly be rendered irrelevant. The biggest problem with it is just that it doesn't have staying power to keep you playing for more than 5 minutes, which is what its sequels have. I just feel like single-screen shoot-em-ups that aren't Galaga or a Galaga sequel get a bad rep. People can play other single-screen arcade-style games all day, so why not a single-screen shoot-em-up? Anyways, Galaxian actually has some sequels you might not know about. See, back during these early days of arcade games, companies used to license out their games to be manufactured by other companies. And I don't just mean for international releases, I mean even in the same country, which is why you'll often find MAME ROMs of games like Galaxian with other companies' logos in them. Some companies like Taito went above and beyond and modified the in-game graphics, creating a version that replaces the enemies with the Space Invaders. But it was Nichibutsu who created the most interesting versions of Galaxian: Moon Alien and Moon Alien Part 2. Moon Alien adds a fancy title screen, recolors the enemies, and makes it so your shots follow the movement of your ship. Its sequel does all of that as well, but also adds an energy meter, making the game more tense. These are definitely cool new ways to play Galaxian and really go to show how much of a deviation from Galaxian Galaga truly is. At some point, all of this seemingly inspired Nichibutsu to create their own single-screen shoot-'em up, Moon Cresta, which would also spawn many sequels. And wouldn't you know it, it was made on Galaxian hardware. Namco would actually take legal action against Nichibutsu when they made more boards than they had agreed upon in their contract, with them having to pay Namco the fees for doing so. But Galaxian hardware was used everywhere, with pretty much all of the major Japanese arcade games of the era running on modified versions of its hardware, and apparently the NES and Famicom's hardware is heavily based on it. I actually believe a similar situation to what happened with Moon Alien and Moon Cresta happened with Phoenix. Phoenix was a 1980 single-screen shoot-'em-up that stood out because instead of shooting down sea or bug-based aliens, you fought an army of birds, and it had a sort of narrative structure to it, and this was before something like Donkey Kong. It was distributed by Taito, but no one knows who developed it, and it couldn't have been Taito as Taito didn't develop their own games at the time. However, after discussing it in a previous video, a lot of you brought to my attention that it may have been developed by people who went on to develop other single-screen shooters, like Tekkon, later known as Tecmo's Pleiades in 1981, or Jaleco's Exerion in 1983. Pleiades was clearly built on top of Phoenix, as the HUD is clearly the same as Phoenix's. But aside from that, it was also found that there was a version of Phoenix labeled as Tekkon Phoenix. Basically, I think something similar to the Moon Alien situation may have happened with Phoenix. Taito licensed the game out. One of these licensees was Tekkon, judging by the fact that there exists Tekkon Phoenix cabinets, and maybe Tekkon saw enough success distributing Phoenix in their own amusement centers that they decided to find the original creators of Phoenix to create Pleiades, and after that, it's likely these people moved to Jaleco. The landing sequence from Pleiades features you controlling your ship while fighting against momentum. This concept would be revisited, albeit in a less annoying way, in Jaleco's shoot-'em-up Exerion, and it features bird-shaped enemies just like Phoenix, though it drops the structure of the previous two games. It's clear to me that these three games are a trilogy made by the same people under three different companies because none of them were that popular enough to copy so closely. But even before Exerion released, it seems the Phoenix team artists may have worked on another Jaleco game called Naughty Boy. No, it's not what you think, which features enemies who look like the Phoenix birds. So yeah, it's pretty clear what Phoenix team went on to do afterwards, but the unfortunate thing is, it's unknown who exactly developed any of these games. I couldn't even find anything for Exerion's 1987 sequel, Exorizer. I will say though, whoever they are, I have to salute them for sticking to a concept, both in terms of gameplay and aesthetic theming. But back to Galaxian, I want to talk about the game's infamous 1984 Famicom port, because the story behind it is way more interesting than you could possibly imagine. But first, I want to correct some misinformation that I may have helped spread in my first video game mysteries video. I said that I thought that Famicom Galaxian was the first game released under Namco's mysterious home label, Namcot. That is not true. It was actually Pac-Man for the MSX a few months earlier. I just forgot and quickly regretted saying this. Aside from that, 3 ports of their games were created for Epoch Super Cassette Vision in 1986 and seemingly weren't developed or published by them, but were still attributed to Namcot rather than Namco. But weirdest of all, the first game they had released outside of arcades simply under the Namco label in Japan, and I don't mean in the title, was Starblade for the 3DO, released on December 16th, 1994, and was their only 3DO game, which makes it weirder that they would continue to release games under the Namcot name, including when they first started making PlayStation games. So this makes the mystery as to why they used the Namcot name more confusing. But if you want to hear more about that, just watch that video, but keep in mind these mistakes. Anyways, Famicom Galaxian was actually a hobbyist project by Namco programmer Haruhisa Udagawa and didn't start out life as a licensed game. But Nintendo was so impressed with the work that had been done, they granted Namco a license, and the rest is history, as Nintendo allowing the biggest video game company at the time to freely port their own games to their system while benefiting from it themselves set the precedent for video game system release licensing. And even though it wasn't the first licensed release for the Famicom, Namco's popularity thanks to Pac-Man and Xevious helped the Famicom a lot. What they didn't know though was that Udagawa had hidden a music player inside of Galaxian, accessible through really elaborate means. This music player contained arrangements of music by composer Michel Laurent and music from Nausicaa and the Valley of the Wind, along with a few other tracks that haven't been identified as anything yet. So maybe give them a listen and see if you would know. This was really impressive, as Galaxian's cart only has 16 kilobytes of space available and only uses around 10 kilobytes of it. Though, while it's been said that Galaxian is the smallest Famicom game, this isn't true. Space Invaders only uses around 8 kilobytes of its much larger selection of 24 kilobytes available. Unfortunately, because this little music player was quickly discovered and contained arrangements of copyrighted music, when the game was re-released for the Famicom Disk System in 1990, it was stripped out of the game. One last thing I find weird about Famicom Galaxian is that the pawns are all green instead of cyan like in the arcade version, and I'm not sure why. It can't be color limitations. Haruhisa Udagawa would continue working at Namco for many years, but eventually he would move on to work at Kaze in the 1990s, a developer founded by a former Namco composer and most notable for their pinball games in Samurai Zombie Nation, the game where you play as the head of the samurai. And by head of the samurai, well, they meant his actual head. I actually have a lot of interesting stuff to say about this game, but I'll probably save it for another video. I know I'm going off on a lot of unrelated tangents in this video already, but this one really deserves its own. Though Udagawa didn't work on that game, he did work on the pinball titles. But you won't believe where he went next. The people who thought making fishing a mandatory part of an action game was a good idea. Yep, he actually assisted Sonic Team with getting the Mega Drive Sonic games to work on the Sega Saturn for the release of Sonic Jam with his technical expertise. Weirdly enough, there seemed to be a sort of exodus of Kaze employees to Sonic Team around this time, as Satoshi Okano, aka the guy who made the second best Sonic design and did the designs for a lot of stuff in Sonic Jam, Sonic Adventure, and Samba de Amigo, also originally created character designs for Kaze's Astro Go-Go for the Super Famicom, and even has a special thanks credit on Zombie Nation. It's actually really interesting that Udagawa joined Sonic Team, as according to this comment I got from somebody on my Mega Drive launch video, around the same time the Mega Drive released, some Namco and Sega employees met at the same bar, and Udagawa supposedly shouted at Yuji Naka, co-founder of Sonic Team, heckling him for programming the awful Super Thunderblade. Unfortunately, this commenter didn't tell me where they heard this anecdote from. However, both had similar interests, as Udagawa created one of the first Famicom emulators for the FM Towns computer in 1990, and Naka created a 3D Famicom emulator for the Sega Mark III, though he contradicts himself by saying he created it in 1988, while saying the game he tested was Dr. Mario, which released in 1990. And I don't know how to end this video. I just wanted an excuse to babble on about some games I find interesting that couldn't really be their own videos, and hopefully you enjoyed hearing it. Anyways, thank you for watching. Tag me in your Sunshine Feeler lore fan art on social media. I want to showcase fan art at the end of my videos now. Thank you to my patrons, and I hope you all feel the sunshine.